Alright, so we're finally going to talk about the Summit of the Future. First of all, I'll be quoting from articles written by Tim Hinchliffe, Josh Walkos, Kit Knightley, and Derek Brose. And I'm going to place the links to their articles in the comments, so be sure to check it out. Now this event started off with a global call. They had Joe Biden, Justin Castro, Lula da Silva, and many other heads of state giving pre-recorded speeches. Yeah, expressing their hopes of subverting your will and consolidating power around the world.
As we meet here in New York at the UN General Assembly for this Summit of the Future, we're at a global inflection point. Faced with escalating instability undermining the very foundations of the international order.
During the call, UN Secretary General and notorious blowhard Antonio Guterres called for reforms to the UN Security Council, which basically means they want to expand the number of permanent members, and they want the UN to have enforcement powers. And who knows, sometimes memes become prophetic. They also called for restructuring the global financial system. As we talked about in the last video, it's all about the economic world order, and the method by which they plan to attain their goal is via the SDGs. These talking points were echoed by pretty much everybody. They all seem to be following a playbook, and it revolves around one key concept, ridding the world of freedom as a whole. Now I know what you're thinking, that's a bit hyperbolic, isn't it? But no, it is not. The truth is buried beneath what James Corbett describes as globalese, manipulative language to coerce the public into dismissing national sovereignty, handing over their personal agency, and to have generations of young people forfeit their future, typically by using fear as their method of persuasion. Antonio Guterres had his typical talking points, that we need 21st century solutions for 21st century problems.
Our institutions cannot keep up because they are designed for another era and another world. The Security Council is stuck in a time warp. The international financial architecture is outdated and ineffective, and we are simply not equipped to take on a wide range of emerging issues. 21st century challenges require 21st century problem-solving institutions. And the Summit of the Future is an important step in the journey to build stronger and more effective multilateralism.
Now, they simply want to expand their power exponentially. They want the UN to be involved in fundamental governance of all nations, redefining your rights, and they want to expand further into education, business, and even key infrastructure projects. Their entire pitch is basically to deem the UN as the de facto global government.
And an upgraded United Nations that can meet the challenges of a new era. As we reach the end of negotiations on the three texts, I appeal to all governments to make sure they are as ambitious as possible to restore the hope and trust we need in order to address the dramatic challenges of our time with a new global consensus.
And as stated, they want to have enforcement powers. It's a really important distinction right there. So, more than likely, you're going to hear me mention that a few more times. They're pretty adamant it's the only way to address these global issues. But that's not true. You'll often hear them allude to this with ambiguous quotes like the old way of operating is no longer fit for service. Antonio Guterres even said the UN should act as a medium between governments and key stakeholders.
The United Nations is in a unique position to act as a platform and a convening space for key stakeholders.
Yeah, they're talking about multinational corporations. As we talk about quite often, the stakeholder capitalism model. Merging the government, the public sector, with corporations, the private sector. And you know, it's too bad the left has cheapened the word fascism, because that's exactly what this is, international corporatism. Speaking of which, these public-private partnerships clearly incentivize corruption. When you have governments from around the world partner with select multinational corporations, those companies are clearly going to drive initiatives through their products and services. The government contracts and subsidies will flow directly through a handful of corporations, effectively making them equal partners within the governance structure. And on top of that, it's going to destroy competition, absolutely obliterate it. It's basically forming a global monopoly on everything, including life itself. As with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, they want to monopolize the human genome and turn that into a commodity as well. Sound good? No, of course not. Now, if you ever wonder why the US deep state wanted Lula da Silva to be president of Brazil, well, this is why.
Que vestimos em 1945 já não nos cabem mais. Há mais de 20 anos temos falado sobre a reforma da governança global. Estamos correndo em círculos. Chegou a hora de agir.
He said we've been talking about global government for more than 20 years, and now's the time to act. Well then, son of a bitch. I'd like to remind you, a UN think tank was paid to develop a pitch for the Great Transition, and within that, they divided human civilization into distinct eras, which is fine in of itself, of course, but the kicker is the fact that they believe we're moving into the planetary phase. And again, I also believe that's true, we are. But as you can see right here, they believe the only form of government that's appropriate for that stage is global government. This was referenced metaphorically by multiple speakers. Lula da Silva claimed the clothes we wore in 1945 don't fit us anymore. And again, that statement might be true, but the answer is not global government. The reality of globalism and centralization of power hits us in the face on a day-to-day basis. In my opinion, the only way to move forward is via decentralization, focusing on individual human rights and rational adoption of technology, instead of, cutting off our nose to spite our face. You simply cannot trust the political class with more power over your everyday life. They are entirely incompatible with your freedom, and it's proven every single day. Now, I'm sorry for having to repeat myself, but, actually, let's do this. I'll speed things up. All of these speakers had 4 main points to hit: expanding the UN Security Council and ensuring they have enforcement powers, expanding the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and then focusing on the Global South. Why? Probably because they need to steal those natural resources for the so-called Green Revolution. Again, simple motivations. Even Joe Biden came out and said the same exact thing basically. I was going to play the clip, but do we really have to suffer through that? I mean, I'm pretty sure we can live without it. It's really the same talking points, over and over again. Repetition is key to propaganda, right? Let's jump over to an article by Tim Hinchliffe with a quote from Derek Rose. He wrote about how the UN was establishing emergency platforms that can swing into action automatically in times of crisis. And the so-called crises that they reference are so widespread that basically everything becomes a reason to circumvent national sovereignty.
As global shocks become more complex and disruptive, we need emergency platforms that swing into action automatically, convening major players according to agreed protocols. We cannot walk into the next global pandemic or shock without being better prepared. In short, we need greater global solidarity today and with future generations, better management of critical issues of global concern, and an upgraded United Nations that can meet the challenges of a new era.
Yeah, the UN has it framed in a way that any crisis can kickstart their emergency response, basically giving them carte blanche to enforce whatever they deem necessary, including superseding national governments and declaring that they must act in a certain way. And this is why they want enforcement powers too. And that's because there's no reason for them to have emergency powers without a method of forcing compliance, right? And I quote, "Ultimately, the push for an emergency platform as part of the Pact for the Future is intended to reinforce the idea that humanity is facing a planetary emergency, which requires the UN's influence and authority to be increased." The document shies away from the term world or global government, instead preferring multilateralism or global governance, but the outcome is the same: a United Nations with more authority to act and to compel nation-states to comply with its edicts. In his works, Brose also goes into great depth about a resetting of the financial system and how that's a crucial component to their plan. Speaking of restructuring the entire global economy, let's check out an article by Josh Walkos. So he says, and I quote, "One of the most striking examples of this expansion is the UN's foray into global economic management. The creation of bodies like the UN's Development Program and the UN's Conference on Trade and Development signaled a shift towards a more interventionist approach in global economics. This expansion represents a dangerous trend toward international socialism and the erosion of national sovereignty. But who truly benefits from this so-called global economic management? Is it the impoverished communities that the UN claims to uplift, or the elite circles tightening their grip on international affairs? Who does it benefit? Well, I can say with certainty, it's not us." And I quote again, "The UN's expansion into global economics is not just a shift. It's a bold overreach into the sovereignty of nations, cloaked under the guise of collective progress." End of quote. Now, as for when the UN decided to get in on global economic management, well, I think we can trace it back to the 1990s. We'll have to go back to the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who served from 1997 to 2006. Anyway, he alluded to this fundamental change in a speech. He claimed the United Nations underwent a quiet revolution in the 1990s. Back in 1998, Kofi Annan stated that the business of the United Nations involved the businesses of the world. End of quote. So I believe that marked a clear shift in that direction, Ironically, the same thing happened with the World Health Organization. Back in 1948, the WHO could only accept donations from other member states. A shift occurred in the 1990s, and by 2005, they changed their policies to allow for private funding. And today, only 20% of its funding comes from member states, with the other 80% coming from private sources, including Big Pharma and people like Bill Gates. And now, as a reflection of that corporatist shift, they want to change the economic structure of the world in the same exact fashion. As we know, they want to do this via the climate narrative. This is the basis for their entire new economic system, one that is carbon-based and predictably predatory. Josh Welkos continues, and I quote, "The push for climate finance reform is less about environmental protection and more about creating new avenues for corporate profit and government control. The proposed changes to the financial architecture under the guise of addressing climate change raise several red flags. Number one, a profit-driven agenda. Many of the largest proponents of climate finance are multinational corporations that stand to benefit enormously from government-subsidized green initiatives. This conflict of interest casts doubt on the true motivations behind their reforms. Number two, government overreach. And I'm paraphrasing, but yeah. Under the nebulous goal of fighting climate change, various governments will intervene in markets and stifle personal freedoms, increase regulations, levy higher taxes, and add restrictions on individual choice. And it's true. All of that is included in this very shitty deal. I mean, they openly talk about it. They want to restrict what food you can eat, what cars you can buy, what media or information you can consume, and it doesn't stop there. In short, they want to dictate every aspect of our lives. And then from there, we have misallocation of resources and lack of accountability. To me, these go hand in hand. There will be zero transparency and zero accountability. Just look at what happens when people try to audit the Pentagon or the DoD. They have failed audits multiple times, and no one seems to care. No one tells anybody where the money actually goes. There's a multi-trillion-dollar black hole in the US government right now. And the same thing's going to happen here, obviously. They will steal trillions from you. In essence, the proposed climate finance reforms will make the pandemic's largest wealth transfer in history from the middle class to the top 1% seem like child's play. They estimate that this agenda is going to take an annual investment of $5 trillion a year. In perpetuity, I guess. Where does all that money come from? Those trillions and trillions of dollars? Well, from you and me. The thing is, once you get past the surface level virtue signaling, the main theme here seems to be greed and consolidation of power via limited competition. And, of course, giving a massive role to a handful of multinational corporations. All in all, the Summit of the Future revolved around a few key aspects to their agenda: the Pact for the Future, the Declaration for Future Generations, and the Global Digital Compact. Now, I would like you to keep in mind, they use circular tactics. They hit you from all sides. Embedded within each of those proposals are other proposals, such as the 30 by 30 agenda and the 50 in 5 platform. Overall, we've heard this stuff before. Kit Knightley put it well, and I quote, "In terms of real content, there are not any new ideas here. We've seen this globalist shopping list of alleged issues before. And yeah, it's true. It's basically the George Soros polycrisis of doom that we've talked about quite a few times. Climate change, conflict, food insecurity, poverty, disinformation, and hate speech. Yes, that's right, the usual quote-unquote problems that collectively form what the document refers to as complex global shocks. Luckily, in the last video, we talked about the Global Shock Report, because it's all connected. So these quote-unquote shocks, the document tells us, can be addressed with a series of solutions that are, again, no surprise. They have respect for international law, expanded cooperation, increasing the power of the United Nations, and the post-COVID buzzword of choice, interoperability, all of which can be broadly defined as our old friend, global government. The most blatantly authoritarian language is reserved for control of the internet. Ah yes, the control grid. It always comes down to this. As I've said before, the proposed new system all hinges on the world adopting digital ID. It's the linchpin to the entire thing. It ties everything together, from the CBDCs, carbon taxes, individual surveillance, facial recognition, social credit scores, and of course their plans for mass censorship. Yeah, all of your online activity and your everyday actions in real life are connected to the prying eyes of the government via this digital grid. In every sense, avoid the digital ID, avoid the digital prison. And really, that's what this whole global compact is about, creating the infrastructure for their massive surveillance state.
The biggest fear that the World Economic Forum has is that there are going to be people that will not comply. Their biggest fear is your fight for freedom. Their biggest fear is that you will make individual decisions for yourself and you will not follow their orders. So this digital stuff is absolutely key, because without it, they can't enforce anything. Without it, they can't mandate that you do something. Without it, they can't control your life. So I don't care if you're talking about carbon emissions and what's safe and effective as far as they are concerned. I don't care if they're talking about an experimental injection, a series of injections, whatever they may be, and what's safe and effective as far as they're concerned. This is not about those individual things. This is about the desire to control you from the outside in. And if they have a digital process whereby they can restrict your movement, your behavior, and your decisions with the click of a button, you are done.
Yeah, so a large part of the Summit of the Future focused on building out the infrastructure for this new system. Technocracy, basically. Contemplating how they could get the entire world's population hooked up to the internet, digital IDs, and the other major focus regarded their plans for censorship. And really, it's just them justifying their actions to themselves. Kinda coping, to be honest. As any rational person knows, there's no justification for it. It's just authoritarianism. But no, they're either in denial or just trying to keep up appearances. As predictably, they justify their actions for censorship with the usual nonsense, explaining why they plan to crush anyone that goes against them as purveyors of hate speech and disinformation. And here's the trick, it's entirely subjective. It's also very, very ironic, given the fact that governments and legacy media are the biggest purveyors of false information, all day, every day. But just remember, it's not about truth at all, it's about control. Just listen to what Hillary Clinton said last week.
We should be, in my view, repealing something called Section 230, which gave, platforms on the internet immunity because they were thought to be just pass-throughs, that they shouldn't be judged for the content that is posted. But we now know that that was an overly simple view, that if the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control. And it's not just the social and psychological effects, it's real harm.
You know, there's a couple really interesting parts here. As pointed out to me on X, the word choice is important. By saying they will lose total control, well, that implies that they already had total control. It also implies their true intention. They don't want partial control or anything like that, they want total control. Yeah, tyrannical aspirations. It is always about political power. That's it. Censorship or they lose total control. And I gotta say, it's beautifully ironic that the very systems that enable this power are simultaneously connecting all of us together, thus undermining them every step of the way. Yeah, sometimes there's beautiful symmetry to the chaos. Really, their only concern is that people are picking apart their lives on a daily basis, which threatens their agenda. Just keep in mind, without free speech, you are not free, period. So hang on to it with everything you have. But let's get a better view of everything by jumping to this article by Tim Hinchliffe, and I quote, "The second Action Day served as a sort of pep rally for the unelected globalist vision for our digital future. But in order to get there by 2030, the speakers highlighted a few key steps that need to be taken. Number 1, access to electricity, because people can't access the internet or use devices without it. And then once they have that, the next step is internet connectivity for all. Because you can't build a digital control grid without having everybody connected to the internet, right? And then after that, they can install digital public infrastructure, otherwise known as DPI. Once everyone has electricity and is connected to the internet, then the digital control grid can be built through DPI, which is basically digital ID, fast payment systems like programmable CBDCs, and massive data sharing. And then finally, crack down on dissent. Label anything that goes against the UN narratives as disinformation and hate speech. Now, that one might be last on their list, but I think it's first on theirs.
Digital platforms are being misused to subvert science and spread disinformation and hate to billions of people. This clear and present global threat demands clear and coordinated global action.
Yeah, he says your right to free speech is, and I quote, a clear and present threat to global action. You know, they could try. Not lying for political power, just a thought. Now, when it comes to electricity, of course I want everyone to have access to electricity and the internet, but my motives are purely for the benefit of the people. These globalist types have another idea in mind, and that's control. And that's because, according to the UN, there are some 2.6 billion people that don't have access to the internet and are therefore not hooked up to the digital control grid. Now again, I'm going to reiterate, it's not that they should not have access to these societal amenities. The real evil lies within their intent. It's not just to make their lives better. It's for control and surveillance more than anything else. One example, one of their talking points was about reducing the price of smartphones to around $20. All about affordability? Not really. And I quote, "This is our chance to connect everyone in the world with the tools they need to thrive in the modern digital economy." End of quote. That's right, it's about CBDCs, which is entirely dependent upon surveillance and, of course, programmability. That way, they have the ability to shut off an individual's access to finances if they're a quote-unquote bad citizen. He says that digital ID unlocks services that were previously out of reach, but according to the World Economic Forum, digital identity not only determines what products, services, and information we can access, but also what is closed off to us. A really, really important aspect right there. Achim Steiner, who's a part of the UN's development program, compared it to the roads and railways of our new digital era.
First, in our partner countries, we are supporting the development of digital policies and strategies that guide country-level digital transformation. Second, we enable the planning and development of digital foundations that underpin inclusive digital transformations, particularly digital public infrastructure, which represent the roads and railway tracks, so to speak, of our new digital era. We've arrived at a point where digital transformation is not just about technology, it's about lives, our children's lives. Consider digital public infrastructure. Every person now has a secure digital identity. We're imagining the year 2030. This has unlocked services that were previously out of reach of so many. When the Digital ID initiative reached a young mother, it didn't just give her access to education and healthcare. For the first time, I feel seen, she said.
Let's continue from Tim Hinchliffe, and I quote again. Imagining a future in 2030, Steiner fantasized, and I quote, "When the Digital ID initiative reached a young mother, it didn't just give her access to education and healthcare. She said, for the first time, I feel seen." And that right there is the entire point of digital identity schemes, to make life nearly impossible to live without them. And with so many services, credentials, and documents all being centralized and connected to an interoperable system, digital identity becomes a tool for complete control over an individual by incentivizing, coercing, or otherwise manipulating human behavior. This is our quote-unquote digital destiny, he said.
This is a moment to redefine our digital destiny. We must turn skepticism into an appetite for the unknown, a catalyst for change, and a willingness to push new frontiers.
Well, I'm pretty sure our destiny involves dismantling their destiny. The trickiest aspect to all of this is the fact that you really have to pay attention to everything they say. They cloak their most authoritarian goals in this utopian aspiration. If people don't dig into the details, then they believe that their goals are simply to help people, such as providing electricity and internet service to the world, but there's more to it. There always is. And Josh Welkos put it perfectly in his article. It's basically a worldwide Skynet. And I quote, "As part of the UN's recently adopted Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact has been hailed as a groundbreaking framework for digital cooperation in AI governance. However, a closer examination reveals a concerning agenda that could have far-reaching implications for individual privacy, freedom, and national sovereignty. This compact has several key objectives. Number 1, connecting all people, schools, and hospitals to the internet. Number 2, making data more open and accessible. Number 3, anchoring digital cooperation in human rights and international law. Number 4, making the online space safe for all, especially children. Number 5, governing artificial intelligence. And number 6, establishing global data governance standards." While those might sound benevolent on the surface, they raise significant concerns about the potential for increased surveillance, control, and erosion of individual freedoms. And really, it's a gateway to universal surveillance. As Edward Snowden has said, a world of universal digital identification is a world without privacy. And he is 100% correct. A system like that could enable unprecedented levels of government surveillance and control over citizens' daily lives. And it's really even worse than that, because they are moving into what Yuval Harari describes as a biosurveillance state. They are no longer just interested in what's happening in your day-to-day life, but now it also includes monitoring what happens under your skin.
COVID is critical because this is what convinces people to accept, to legitimize total biometric surveillance. We want to stop this epidemic. We need not just to monitor people, we need to monitor what's happening under their skin. What we have seen so far, it's corporations and governments collecting data about where we go, who we meet, what movies we watch. The next phase is the surveillance going under our skin. We now see mass surveillance systems established even in democratic countries, which previously rejected them. And we also see a change in the nature of surveillance. Previously, surveillance was mainly above the skin. Now it's going under the skin.
Embedded in his hand is a microchip that serves as his keys, his ID, and his wallet.
Governments want to know not just where we go or who we meet. Above all, they want to know what is happening under our skin. What's our body temperature? What's our blood pressure? What is our medical condition?
In a matter of seconds, the chip is inserted. The transformation is complete.
When scanned, all of a person's information about their vaccination status is shown on a reader or phone.
Now humans are developing even bigger powers than ever before. We are really acquiring divine powers of creation and destruction. We are really upgrading humans into gods. We are acquiring, for instance, the power to re-engineer life. Humans are now hackable animals.
You will own nothing, and you will be happy.
You know, the whole idea that humans have, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will, that's over.
Now the compact's emphasis on making the online space safe for all is a classic example of sacrificing liberty for the illusion of security. History has shown that such initiatives can often lead to increased censorship and surveillance. In the digital realm, the concept of safety can be particularly problematic, and that's because it can be used to justify a ton of authoritarian aspects, such as mass surveillance, content censorship, mandatory identification, encryption backdoors, and it doesn't stop there. The danger lies in the subjective nature of the word quote-unquote safety, and the potential for what they call mission creep. What starts as a measure to protect children or prevent terrorism can easily expand to suppress political dissent or marginalize certain people. The emphasis on safety often overlooks the importance of risk and freedom in a healthy society. However, I will say, I believe their reasons are explicitly malicious and predictable. I don't think they have a benevolent bone in their collective bodies. They want this power for one reason, to control the narrative. Their entire agenda hinges on censorship, because no one in their right mind wants to live in this dystopian vision. And on top of that, if your entire agenda is threatened by citizens speaking openly, well then, you might be the bad guys, don't you think? In fact, there was an entire separate event, entirely dedicated to their plans for censorship, including with big tech to circumvent the First Amendment. They called it the Future of Information Integrity. And one of the main speakers was Melissa Fleming, who you might remember. She said, "We own the science."
You know, we partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world, should know it. And
yeah, they are entirely consumed by delusions of grandeur. And it's the same with all of them. If you don't agree with them, flat out, they'll target you. People are being put in jail right now as we speak in other nations for social media posts. Some have occurred in the UK that are purely thought crimes. And the United States wants new laws against whatever they deem to be disinformation and hate speech. Criminal penalties for speech and opinions. I don't know. If you can't see where this is going, then I don't know what to tell you. But the whole thing is very strange. The mind virus is a very real concept, a sort of social contagion, and they have been entirely captured by it, swallowed whole. They have absolutely zero self-awareness, no self-reflection, no introspective abilities at all. And I'm starting to wonder if the possibility of them being wrong ever even crosses their minds. I'm not too sure it does, which makes them not only delusional, but also dangerous. Well, alright, maybe, just maybe, they're only motivated by power and are really good sociopathic liars. That could be the case. With that said, I want to finish up with a clip of John Kerry. Recently, he had some interesting comments too, claiming that free speech is getting in the way. I believe this took place at the UN's Climate Week.
It's part of our problem, particularly in democracies, in terms of building consensus around any issue. It's really hard to govern today. You can't, there's no, the referees we used to have to determine what's a fact and what isn't a fact have kind of, been eviscerated to a certain degree. And people go, and people self-select where they go for their news or for their information. And then you just get into a vicious cycle. So it's really, really hard, much harder to build consensus today than at any time in the 45, 50 years I've been involved in this. And there's a lot of discussion now about how you curb those entities in order to guarantee that you're going to have, some accountability on facts, et cetera. But look, if people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and, has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change.
Our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to just hammer it out of existence, he said. Any politician that claims your right to free speech is a threat should be shunned from society as a whole. Their intentions could not be more clear. They do not represent you. They want to rule over you. Yes, to them, you are just an obstacle that has to be hammered out of existence. So take a look at the articles from Tim Hinchliffe, Josh Welkos, Kit Knightley, and Derek Brose, as there's a lot of information I did not touch on. All of them are extremely well written and insightful. Support the independent journalists any way you can, because in our current situation, it's the only way to get a clear-eyed view of our world. Until next time, once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals, or you could use PayPal. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas. And yes, I do hope you have a good night.